I'm Ben Weingarten.
I'm Will Chamberlain.
I'm Inez Stepman.
I'm Amber Duke.
And this is NatCon Squad, where common good and common sense meet. NatCon Squad is produced by the Edmund Burke Foundation, the home for national conservatism. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. Well, as always, we've got a diverse array of timely topics this week. Inez is going to kick us off to talk about the passage of the House budget bill. I'll talk a little bit about the coming monster controversy between the executive branch and the judiciary, Trump versus the lawfare inquisitionists. Amber will talk a little bit about the Trump administration upending the White House Correspondents Association and its relations with the press. And then Will take us home to talk a little bit about a related story, Jeff Bezos' revamp of the Washington Post opinion page. But with that, we'll kick it off with Inez.
So the House passed a budget very narrowly, widely considered a victory for the Speaker, for Speaker Johnson, because he is working with such a narrow margin and there's such disagreement within the Republican caucus. So this is also a bill that Trump lobbied hard for, which I'll get to in a moment. But the basics of the bill, as I understand it, are that the tax cuts from 2017, this renews many elements of those tax cuts. It gives funding for that goes towards the border and building a border wall and border security, which is very necessary for the Trump administration and obviously a high priority. It also increases defense spending, which is something that the lone Republican holdout, Thomas Massie, is probably against. But I mean, personally, I think it's a good thing given when we look around the world, what's happening. I guess the question is whether that money will be spent wisely. And that's probably something we'll continue to be talking about in the future weeks. But so overall, of course, as all of these big bills do, this continues to increase the deficit, increase America's debt. There is a promise of some cuts in this bill, but they're doing it as a kick, so that committees later are going to come up with allegedly cuts to pay for various things in this bill, which is, again, a little dubious. We've seen this movie before. To me, my sort of fiscal lodestar on this is always Congressman Chip Roy. Chip Roy has been a holdout on other things. He is voting for this bill. So I think that's notable, that it's probably a better deal than Republicans often get, or can get their coalition together to get. There's also a question that Democrats are going to push hard on, which is potential cuts to Medicaid program. There's potential sort of town hall. It's hard to tell whether it's astroturfed or it's 2010 style Tea Party, sort of shouting at town halls and constituents clearly angry, alleged constituents really angry about various aspects of cuts, including DOGE and other things, and probably Medicaid battle gets folded into that. So those are the basics of the bill. The things that I think are interesting here, one, Trump playing heavily in the legislative game, calling up people, strong-arming people, really hurting cats on this one. That's markedly different from Trump's first term. He really didn't play much in the legislative battles. And if anyone recalls, this is how we ended up with no repeal on Obamacare, in large part, because if you let Republicans in Congress sort of march to their own tunes, they never agree. We end up with nothing. And obviously, at this point, I feel like the sane conservative trusts Trump's judgment probably better than the average Republicans in Congress about what's possible and what we can get in terms of priorities. So interesting that he's playing in this budget battle in a more serious way. He really didn't do that so much. And I think it's really necessary to get anything legislative done out of the vestigial organ that is Congress. Again, if they want to revive themselves, they can start passing serious legislation. But yet again, we end up with a giant bill with some good things and some bad things. And this is really the only work that Congress does every year. So I don't know what you guys think about the contents of the bill, whether or not you think this is a good deal. One final point, this is going to go to reconciliation, right? So there's going to be a totally different budget in the Senate, and then there's going to be a reconciliation process. And that's where a lot of these things will be finalized. There is the possibility. So the 2017 tax cuts, this is obviously my pet issue, but I think it's important. The 2017 tax cuts have a little ballyhooed tiny tax on college endowments, 1.4%. There is the potential, we can do this through reconciliation. If we wanted to raise that tax, There's a couple of things floating around, a couple numbers floating around. One's 14%. One is up to the hedge fund tax, which a lot of these universities are functionally hedge funds with a university attached to them, raising it up to 35 or 37%, which I believe is the hedge fund normal, like sort of trading tax on these endowments. So 14%, that 30-something% number, that's all possible through reconciliation. That does not have to get 60 votes in the Senate. So theoretically, Republicans could do that with just their votes if they wanted to. And that's one of the things that I'll be looking for in these reconciliation battles. But, throwing it out to the group for all kinds of things. One, how the House is balancing between the moderate caucus on the one hand and like the fiscal hawks on the other. And what we can expect from that balance in the future, about Trump really playing in these battles in a way that he didn't during the first term, whether or not you think overall this is a good deal, or overall, I mean, to me, like I've been critical about basically all of these deals, and to the point where I'm sort of sick of it. But this one seems like pretty decent by low Washington, D.C. standards to me. So I'm curious what you all think. But yeah, with that, I'll throw it out to everyone.
Yeah. Go ahead. I have just one big view on these battles, which is that the House really just needs to go along to get along. The House Republicans need to work together, because we've been under the assumption that the power of the purse lies with with Congress, the legislative branch. That's sort of a default assumption, and it's the explicit way our government works. But I have a thesis now that the actual power of the purse really does lie in the executive branch, because the Congress is just not capable of going line by line through expenditures in a way that the executive branch is. And as a result, Congress is basically only able to really propose these top line budget cuts for everybody that are horribly unpopular and that nobody actually wants. Meanwhile, you have Elon going line by line in Doge and finding waste, fraud, and abuse left and right. And also the executive branch itself doing things like just, hey, maybe we could just stop funding USAID, using authorities we already have. And so what that means is that the role of Congress, especially a Republican Congress, is to not make any deals with the Democrats, because the first thing Democrats are going to want is to shut down what Elon Musk and Doge and the rest of the executive branch are doing to kind of rein in these rogue government agencies and actually reduce spending and get rid of all these Democrat piggy banks. So I think that's the thing the Freedom Caucus and people like Mastia really need to think about here, is that ultimately the best thing they can do for the government, for federal spending, is just to be team players for the next year or so and let the executive take the lead on spending cuts, rather than trying to fight for broad-based spending cuts that they won't be able to achieve.
Yeah, I'm going to withhold too much judgment at this point in the process, because we also know that the Senate is doing this in two separate bills. At least that's the posture they've taken so far. And then this bill from the House is sort of setting up the framework for how the reconciliation process is going to go. But we haven't received much by the way of details of what specific programs are going to be funded as part of this bill, what parts are going to be defunded. They say they're adding $100 million for border security, but what does that actually look like when it gets down to brass tacks? So I'm not happy about the expansion of the deficit, but I also want to see what are the line items that are going to be in this final reconciliation package. Like, sure, it's great that the Republicans can find some way to get together and actually pass a budget without the help of the Democrats, but I just want to know more at this point what specifically the final product is going to look like.
I'll also, to some extent, withhold judgment on the merits of the bill, but I will say that the politics are kind of interesting and intriguing, and maybe significant here, in that, to Inez's point, the House Freedom Caucus, this was negotiated pretty much explicitly with the House Freedom Caucus, and House Freedom Caucus members did not stand in the way of its potential passage. You had a few holdouts at the end for various reasons. But at the end of the day, despite the fact that there are myriad incentives to blow up legislative packages like these, at the end of the day, the majority held. And that is a striking change from what we've seen in past Congresses, whether this is on the merits, whether this is the power of the politics of Trump and sort of the backroom negotiations that surely had to take place, but also as with the nominees, I think this illustrates the strength of the whipping process, and that's really significant. Democrats stick together and they go as far as they can in trying to achieve their agenda when they do work together. So it's a notable change where you have a Republican Party that really is unified here, despite there obviously being philosophical and political disagreements. Many of them well-founded, obviously. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect I would say is, does this, and it's really more a question than an answer, what does this augur, or does this augur anything when it comes to codifying the rest of the Trump agenda? I've harped on it and I'll continue to harp on it. Setting aside the spending, and obviously that is hugely significant in driving everything. If you have these fantastic executive actions that represent, a comprehensive attempt to use every lever of executive power possible to achieve a conservative populist nationalist agenda, but there's no follow through on the legislative side. It's not codified. Obviously, it won't outlast President Trump, and certainly, of course, the Trump agenda can get, and as I'll talk about, gets gummed up in the courts, and Democrats have viewed that as basically the chief forum in which to fight everything that the administration is trying to achieve. So there's a question here of whether there will be unity on myriad other issues that ought to be codified via statutes, and Congress ought to try and pass to ensure that this agenda is a durable one that far outlasts these 4 years. And then the last related point I'll make is just that, to Will's point, this increases the necessity for a real fight on impoundment. That is, the power for the president not to spend appropriated funds to the extent not necessary to faithfully execute the agenda, to faithfully execute the laws. And that is obviously a fight that this administration, I think, relishes, that it wants to have, that it intends to have. And we'll see what ends up landing it at the Supreme Court ultimately, and to what extent it gets fast-tracked there. But that's going to be a major fight. All of this, of course, in part goes back to the dereliction of duty of the legislative branch to legislate and to punt everything essentially to the administrative state and or the courts to essentially determine what is law and what is not law. I don't really see a push now for the legislative branch to restore its powers and to serve as arguably the strongest of what are purportedly co-equal branches. But obviously that means that it's imperative for the president to fulfill the duties that the legislative branch refuses to fulfill. And with that, I will kind of use that as a segue into my own segment, which is to talk about all of the clashes that are already occurring between the administration and the judiciary branch. And then I think the ultimate fight that we're going to see happen over the next 4 years, and really probably over the next year, frankly. So there have been any number of, as we've talked about before, efforts from oftentimes either left-wing states, left-wing activist groups to forum shop and to try to find a district court judge who will halt the president's ability to do the most basic things, essentially. Remove subordinates from power, freeze programs, freeze the spending of funds, be able to access treasury systems. All of these different cases that have been brought, and I think at last count there might have been over 70 cases that have already been brought against the administration, and in any number of instances, the Democrats are finding district court judges who are willing to not only halt the policies at times via temporary restraining orders, which are generally treated as not appealable for a couple of weeks, but also they're starting now to get preliminary injunctions issued to freeze these policies. So essentially, if you can find the right judge, one of over 700, I think, district court judges in the country, that judge is supreme over the president and can micromanage the executive branch and the president's policies and the president's attempt to reinstill commander-in-chief's authority over the executive branch as opposed to the lawless, unelected, unaccountable administrative state. So there have been a few recent rulings on this. There's a push by one federal judge to force the administration to unfreeze the freeze on foreign aid, and that payments basically have to be made by the administration out to, of course, the various NGOs that are recipients of this foreign aid by tonight. We're recording this on Wednesday. The administration is fighting that. It's working its way up through the appeals process, but that's one. Then we have an effort by another federal judge to unfreeze the administration's freeze on financial assistance, federal financial assistance. Generally, that's now under preliminary injunction. If you look into the background of these judges, by the way, and I started to do that, and I've been tweeting out one of them, for example, on this foreign aid issue, Judge Amir Ali. He was passed by, I think, a 1-vote majority under Joe Biden as a federal judge. And you look at what he testified before Congress about the very limited power of federal judges and that they need to be very careful about their usage of injunctions. Now you see he's operating completely differently, that he's on the bench. There's also been, of course, a push to unfreeze the freeze on the refugee program into this country that the administration imposed. So all of these areas where the president has broad scope of powers and purview here, you have these judges deigning to step in and themselves operate essentially as the president and to micromanage these decisions. So ultimately, I think where we're going to get to is there has to be a fight over, first of all, can you appeal temporary restraining orders? And the Supreme Court thus far has been derelict when it was brought to its feet in another case currently pending, but also nationwide injunctions writ large. I mean, their injunctions are supposed to exist and bind the parties to an individual case. Not everyone in the country, because one federal judge says that in a certain instance, certain plaintiffs have brought a case that ought to be applicable to everyone. So that's one issue. And then I think there's a question of what other checks are there? Is there going to be ultimately a fight where the administration refuses to comply with an order because it appears to be totally lawless and out of bounds, and because there's no relief that's been brought to bear by a superior court, and that kind of forces the issue? This actually came up in confirmation hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee today for a couple of high-level posts, including for Solicitor General and for the top of the Civil Rights Office at DOJ. And then beyond that, are we going to see, and some members of the House have already started to draft up articles of impeachment for some of these judges for abuse of their judiciary power and lawlessness. Are we going to see more attempts at impeachment? Are we going to see attempts at judiciary reform? Are we going to have the collapses of certain districts or the reorganization? Or is Congress going to put forth legislation to force appeals of these sorts of TROs or injunctions, put them on a fast track to the Supreme Court, for example? I think all these questions ought to be on the table because you're witnessing judiciary supremacy that subverts the rule of law here. And so I wonder what you make of some of these cases and where you think these clashes are ultimately going to shake out.
Well, I have to say, like, I'm much more concerned about the nationwide injunction issue than about the TROs. They are ultimately temporary, and that's the reason they're not appealable. At most, then you're talking about an annoyance, a slowdown. And I'm just not that concerned. I realize how much we've gotten done in a month, and it feels like any day this administration is slowed down is a problem, but I'm not ultimately that worried about that issue. Nationwide injunction is another story. And I totally agree with you there, Ben, that this is something that the Supreme Court is going to have to deal with. We have that famous Thomas dissent flagging the importance of this early on as basically the ability of a single, federal judge, not even sometimes on the appellate court, right? We're talking about like district judge that can essentially enjoin policies for the entire country on the basis of his politics. Now, maybe the solution for that is impeachment of judges. That would be a new way to use impeachment of judges in this country. Then again, like that's basically how we're using impeachment of the president for the last several decades. So, I mean, once these powers exist and they're there to be used potentially. So that's one way. That's political. That would be the more political way of dealing with it. Of course, the Supreme Court might solve the problem themselves, and there's some really good basis to do so. And again, just send everyone back to read that Thomas dissent, which I think lays out the problems quite well. On the larger issue here, there is a huge legal battle that is being teed up about the limits of executive power to control just the executive branch, right? And there are very serious constitutional arguments that both Congress and the courts are interfering unduly with the ability of the executive branch not to control the other branches, not even to make policy, but to control itself, right? The ability of the president to hire and fire his own alleged employees in the executive branch. And there are kind of different tendrils of that battle. One might be independent agencies, right? There's a case called Humphrey's Executor back from the FDR days, I think is probably ripe for overturning at this point. There have been some encouraging precedents, Collins against Yellen in 2021. Generally speaking, this court has taken non-delegation seriously and has taken, on the other hand, the executive power and unitary executive more seriously than previous courts probably for 100 years. So, I mean, I'm relatively optimistic about these fights, but make no mistake, they are getting kicked to the Supreme Court. We are going to have a series of decisions on, I think, I would track two major issues that, again, each have a bunch of legal tendrils. The first is this power of the president to hire and fire. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see some of the century of very, very intense protections for civil career servants potentially invalidated constitutionally, right? Because ultimately that was Congress really, really interfering with who the president can hire and fire, who works for him, right? Within the executive branch. And then this judicial limitation as well, like how much does the president have the power to hire anyone he wants, to remove how he wants? That's one like kind of sort of category of issues that I would look for. The second category of issues will be non-delegation and how much the executive branch can make law, whether it's actually constitutional to have all of these bureaucrats operating the way that they have been at this point, aggressively for the last 30 or 40 years, but in reality, all the way back to Wilson. We're going to have a series of decisions on the constitutionality of the way that American governance has operated, increasingly for a century. And I think those things are way, way overdue. There are things that, FedSoc has had, plenty of panels and yapping about. It is always funny to me to see who meant it and who didn't in these circles, who was actually concerned about the unconstitutionality of, unelected bureaucrats making policy and who apparently wasn't, because they don't like the way that Trump is going about actually wresting the control of his own branch back for himself. So those two issues, in my view, those are probably actually, aside from immigration and the border, I think those are probably the two singular most important issues that could be resolved by the Trump presidency. And we might very well find ourselves at the end of these 4 years with a government that actually looks a little bit more like what the founders envisioned, with the three branches of government instead of this like all-powerful floating fourth branch.
It's been pretty clear to me that the foreign aid freeze is perfectly acceptable when you go back to the Biden administration and aid freezes in general. Biden froze funding for the border wall for quite some time. There was a court case about it where he was blocked from doing that. But then the Government Accountability Office released a report saying that when Biden froze funding for the border wall, it was totally different than when Trump froze funding to Ukraine, although they couldn't explain why, and said that there was nothing illegal about it. It was perfectly within his executive branch powers. And then when you go to the end of the Biden administration, he had some money that was already allocated from Congress to give to Ukraine, and he was exercising his judgment on when to send that money and when to have the Treasury actually approve the payments, and ended up rolling out a ton of it in the last month of his admin because he was worried that Trump wouldn't send it, including $20 billion in early December, then another $6 billion later in December, $500 million in early January. So clearly there is the ability for the executive to make decisions about when and how money is actually pushed out the door for different causes. And it seems like the left is trying to make the case that because Trump's pause is indefinite, that is effectively a cancellation. Well, Joe Biden was funding border wall, or was pausing border wall funding for an indefinite period of time, and that was considered totally acceptable. So this is an obvious double standard here with the courts in trying to rein in very clearly delineated powers of the executive branch.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I want to point out is I'm a little bit annoyed by the failure of the Supreme Court to already intervene. I think they really should have intervened in the special counsel Hampton-Dellinger case, where the district court imposed an injunction forcing President Trump to continue to hire somebody ahead of a single member agency to continue like exerting executive power in a way that the president doesn't approve of. I mean, it's so obviously a violation of the separation of powers. It's so obviously a violation of all the recent Supreme Court precedent on removal that even a temporary restraining order really does violence to the administration, even if it's going to be over pretty soon. It should have been stopped. It wasn't. It's very disappointing. And I hope that the Supreme Court gets its act together and realizes that like the consequence of letting these district judges run wild will potentially be an actual constitutional crisis where, there's a real question of whether or not the executive is just simply going to have to ignore these lawless rulings.
With that, let's go to Amber to talk about the White House Correspondents Association controversy.
Right. So much like Trump has declared war on the cartels down in Mexico, he is declaring war on the cartel known as the White House Correspondents Association, which for decades has controlled access to the press briefing room, as well as who gets to serve on pool duty. And for those who are unfamiliar, pool duty is effectively following the president around for the day. It's a small handful of reporters that get to go to events that are not open to the full White House press corps. And they report on what's happening, what the president is saying, sometimes get to ask questions and transcribe those events and share them out with the rest of the press corps and the media, because there's basically limited space in events that take place in the Oval Office and the diplomatic room and other places on the White House complex or elsewhere outside of that. And the White House announced this week that they are going to be taking control of who gets to serve on the press pool away from the White House Correspondents Association. And this is in addition to adding that new media seat in the briefing room where they've had one or two people sitting in what are seats that are typically reserved for staff of the White House for groups that are not official members of the White House Correspondents Association to get to ask questions during press briefings. And the White House Correspondents Association is predictably having a meltdown over this, claiming that this is an unprecedented seizure of power from the WHCA and that the White House is effectively choosing who gets to cover the administration and will end up freezing out legacy outlets or mainstream media outlets in favor of outlets that they perceive are friendlier, which at least to this point has not been the case. HuffPost apparently has a seat still in the press pool, as do a lot of other mainstream media outlets. But the WHCA, the way that it operates for basically its entire existence has been to increase access for their friends in liberal and legacy media at the expense of independent and conservative media. And just a couple of examples from my time covering the White House. I was a White House correspondent for the Daily Caller and then covered the White House at least part of the time at the Spectator. And when I was at the Daily Caller, we did not have a permanent seat in the briefing room. I had to stand in the aisle with everybody else who didn't have a permanent seat. And it wasn't until the Biden administration, when they changed the seating chart, that the Daily Caller was finally given a briefing seat. The Spectator never had one. And even still, the Daily Caller seat is shared with multiple other outlets. So all of the large corporate media outlets that get the first 3 rows of seats are permanent. They're in there every single day. If there's a briefing, they know that they're going to have that seat and they're going to get to ask a question. If you work for the Daily Caller or a bevy of other conservative media outlets, you have, let's say, a 5 or 6 day rotation where if there's a briefing on Thursday and you're not in the seat that day, that's too bad, so sad. You have to stand in the aisle and hope that the press secretary sees you. This was a very explicit problem during the Biden administration because Karine Jean-Pierre had an unofficial policy that she did not call on reporters who were standing in the aisle. So if you did not have a seat assigned to you by the WHCA, you effectively had zero access to the administration because Joe Biden hardly ever took questions, and you were basically forced to only get, you were only able to get access during those press briefings, whether it was with Jen Psaki or Karine Jean-Pierre. And the WHCA has been asking conservative media outlets to back its efforts to, one, get the Associated Press access restored to the White House coverage, and then 2, to oppose the administration taking control of the press pool. which it consists of only like 30 outlets, right? So this is even smaller than the group that is able to go into the briefing room, whether you have a seat or you stand in the aisle, and the WHCA gets to decide the rotation. They claim in some cases it's a lottery system, but amazingly, NBC and CBS and all of the TV reporters always seem to win the lottery. I mean, it's obviously a big scam. But during the Biden administration, especially during the pandemic, there was a significant curtailing of press access because one of the policies that the Biden administration implemented in 2021 was initially, if you wanted to get access to the White House during COVID, you would have to take a COVID test that was paid for by the administration, or you had to have proof that you were vaccinated. They changed that policy such that individual outlets had to actually pay for a daily COVID test, which cost $150 just to get access to the White House campus. So you can imagine if you're a independent podcaster or you work for a smaller conservative news outlet, you cannot afford to pay $150 5 to 6 days a week to be able to access the White House every single day to do your job. And so it naturally favored large corporate media outlets that expense is basically a drop in the bucket for their overall operating budget, even if they have 6, 7 reporters that regularly cover the White House. And the WHCA didn't see a problem with this. They thought that this was no big deal. We have to do the 6-foot social distancing. So all of the people who get seats in the back of the room now not only have to rotate with 5 other outlets, but have to rotate with 30 to 40 different outlets just to get their chance in the briefing seat. I was at the Spectator at the time that formation was announced. I got the seat once every 35 days, I believe. And naturally, the one day that I get the seat, Jen Psaki and later on Karine Jean-Pierre stopped taking questions after the first 2 rows because those are their friends in the corporate media who aren't going to ask them difficult questions. So you wait 35 days to get in the seat, and then you don't get to ask a question anyway. So a bunch of conservative reporters that I know and independent reporters basically just stopped covering the White House during this period because there was no guarantee. In fact, it was the opposite, a guarantee that you weren't ever going to be able to elicit any information from the administration. So when the WHCA comes now and says, oh my gosh, this is an unprecedented affront to press access, you just look at them and say, where were you for the past 4 years when everybody at the bottom of the food chain who's not your personal friend got no chance of covering the White House in a fair manner against these large corporate media outlets? And one final point on this before I open up to the group, I apologize, but this is like my soapbox issue because I've been dealing with this for basically the entire time I've been a reporter. But Biden changed the rules to the White House hard pass system as well. The White House hard passes have always been given out by the White House through the Secret Service. They have never been controlled by the WHCA. And Biden changed the rules so that 400 plus members of the media who had a hard pass, which means you can access the White House campus every single day without having to do a special background check or fill out a form, had those hard passes revoked. For no clear reason, they did not explain why they were doing this, but they basically said if you're not on the White House campus 75% of your time on the job, then you don't get to have one anymore. Again, no outcry from the WHCA. So this is very obviously not about press access. This is one of the most accessible administrations in modern history. This is about the fact that the WHCA does not get to control the process to the benefit of legacy outlets at the expense of their colleagues in independent and conservative media. So there's really no time for me for the tiers from what is a cabal, a cartel, whatever you want to call it, in terms of press access to the White House.
Yeah, Amber's totally correct about the hypocrisy here. There was no outcry, and all the things she listed, they've yanked press passes from conservative outlets. They've made it impossible for them to ask questions. So nothing about this is new. The only thing that's new is who's sitting in the chairs, right? And that's what they're complaining about. So I also have very little patience on that. Like, yes, maybe there is a larger question about, of course, we don't want the president and people in positions of power only giving interviews or only being asked questions by people they've personally selected, screened, potentially gave questions to beforehand, something that we've seen over and over again in Democratic administrations, by the way. Like, yes, that is a bad thing. It is a good thing for people in power to be held to some kind of press scrutiny. But first of all, I don't know how relevant that is in like the 24-hour news cycle with social media and stuff. It's not like people don't see directly what the president and the vice president are saying. Two, as Amber noted, this is not an administration that's been hiding behind only friendly press. Like, as a matter of practicality, I mean, Vance is on the Sunday shows practically every week. President Trump takes questions from hostile media constantly. So, like, as a matter of fact, this is an administration that has subjected themselves constantly to the scrutiny, even of these legacy media outlets who are obviously have been, completely dishonest about them in the past. But then, just on the substance of the AP and the Gulf of America thing, like, I have no idea how they can justify not covering this legal name change when they change the names, every time the left changed the name of a school or a military base to something obscene, like just completely incredibly crazy, right? Dolores Huerta military base. I'm making that one up, but they went along with that. So like, there's actually no real justification why they don't print Gulf of America, other than like, I mean, of course you can write an op-ed saying this is a stupid idea to change the name of Gulf of Mexico to Gulf of America, but as a matter of like sort of AP standards, I don't see any argument for why they shouldn't. It's an official name change. They are reflecting the official name of the thing now. So it's just funny to me that that's the substance of what this is about. But obviously, bottom line, this is about, there's no real problem with access to the president or this administration taking tough questions. They've taken plenty of tough questions from plenty of, honestly, frankly, dishonest media hacks who have lied about them over and over again. So that's really not the issue here. It's about, who's in and who's out, and legacy media losing their privileged position.
So really briefly, just on the AP side of things, obviously just to add to the hypocrisy here, the AP via its style book or style guide literally polices the speech of all of legacy media and beyond. So the contrast here is pretty remarkable in the, how dare the Trump administration type response when they literally control and police essentially the language of media writ large. Setting that aside here, I think to both Amber's point and Inez's point, at the end of the day, this is really about a monopoly or an oligopoly losing control of its gatekeeping power, and it hates that. And I think it's a really bad look for the journalist class in terms of the self-importance and the sanctimony of how dare the administration do this when, it's clearly that they're afraid they're losing their power and control, their ability to filter news and information. And it's hurting their business model. It's hurting their pride. It's hurting their prestige. And they hate that. And these cries of Putin, as noted, are ridiculous here when you're talking about the most accessible administration probably in the history of the United States. And, I think to kind of add to that, at the end of the day, they don't have an inalienable right to have exclusive, special, privileged access to that president. And that's what they really dislike here, that there's actually some democratization going on in the White House press briefing room, and that threatens their power and prestige and their pride.
Yeah, I mean, with everybody else here, I have zero patience for these people whining. In particular, I'm not happy to see Fox News out there defending the current system. It's pretty obviously there to benefit incumbents, and to watch Fox News kind of effectively betray the other conservative outlets in order to maintain their currency as like the only conservative establishment outlet is obnoxious. So I don't have any time for this. This is just entitled journalists who are also quite disgusting. I think Cernovich has some good tweets out there about the decrepit state of the bathroom in the press briefing room. So yeah, I
can confirm it is disgusting. They literally leave like empty food wrappers everywhere. Like the bathroom's constantly out of order. The vending machine never works. These people are slobs.
And that's before we get to their actual reportage. And on that note, let's turn it back to Will to talk about some coming reforms purportedly at the Washington Post.
So yeah, apparently Jeff Bezos has had quite enough of the current situation with the Washington Post opinion page. He posted on Twitter, or on X rather, that He was essentially changing the direction of the editorial page to focus on free markets and social free and personal liberties. Basically deciding that the Washington Post opinion page should look more like the opinion page at Reason, or something that the Cato Institute would be happy about. Which honestly, I'm perfectly fine with. The way I basically look at this is a kind of let them fight between classical liberals and establishment Democrats who've just suddenly lost access to one of their primary posts and privileges. The Washington Post opinion page is obviously quite unhappy with this. Apparently, the opinion editor resigned when told of the new direction of the opinion page, and Philip Bump went out there and tweeted something obscene, basically saying that he was very displeased with it. I think this is actually one of those cases where Jeff Bezos seems to finally be getting tired of the Washington Post behavior. I think we saw a little bit of this when he talked about how he wanted the Post to be generally more objective, maybe a few months back. I think this is maybe the first actual substantive power move he's made. He's like, guess what? The opinion page is going to be like this now. And I mean, you couldn't see, if liberals were furious about this before, the new establishment liberals are apoplectic at the idea that it would now be a libertarian opinion page rather than just an anti-Trump and pro-Hamas mouthpiece. I think that the Post, every opinion writer at the Post deserves this. I hope they all get fired. I don't necessarily see Bezos as some huge ally of the right. And I don't think that he'll have a lot of influence. I just don't see that his view, this combination of social liberalism and economic libertarianism, to be particularly popular, to have a lot of currency in the country. Certainly doesn't have a lot of currency on the MAGA right, for example. But gosh, if he just wants to seize a power center away from the left, I'm perfectly happy with it. And so I don't know what you guys think about this, but I see it as a win, even if it's not the MAGA right isn't suddenly going to own the WaPo opinion page.
Yeah, I'd call this one more manifestation of the Trump effect. Yeah, maybe from Bezos's perspective, this is on the merits and it's about a philosophical change. Maybe it's on the politics. Maybe it's on the fact that the paper, like many legacy publications, continues to relegate itself to a smaller and smaller self-selecting audience, and it's going to hurt its relevancy to the extent it continues down the path that it was already on. I would make one brief comment, which it was remarkable to see some folks at the Washington Post respond to this. So Jeff Stein, who's on the news side, he tweeted out, "Massive encroachment by Jeff Bezos into the Washington Post opinion section today. Makes clear dissenting views will not be published or tolerated there," like before. He adds then, "I still have not felt encroachment on my journalism on the news side of coverage, but if Bezos tries interfering with the news side, I will be quitting immediately and letting you know." Again, beyond illustrating kind of the haughtiness of folks within these publications, I see a perfect analog here between those working at the publications and those working in the federal bureaucracy who want to sabotage and subvert and stymie the president. And you see the insubordination here. This is your boss saying we're making a change, and you're basically going to thwart and say F you to your boss. That's the response. It's the same thing that prevails seemingly within the federal government as well. And you can see why those in corporate media are so geared up to try and champion their cause, because they take the same perspective, apparently, about listening to authority and doing what their organizations ask of them.
Yeah, I think it's interesting the two sort of priorities he chose. I don't think that those would have been the ones I would have chosen, just because they do seem pretty libertarian and maybe out of step with where our current politics is at the moment. But I guess it depends on how it's implemented. I do think that the meltdown from the Washington Post reporters is pretty hilarious. And I don't see any problem with the owner of the paper exercising some editorial control after the paper has lost millions of dollars in subscribers over the past 5 years, for its just ridiculous and out of touch with reality posture towards Republicans, conservatives, Trump, the list goes on. I mean, the reality is that this newspaper is a business. It's not a public utility. So if the current system is not working, and then you complain about the billionaire who is bankrolling your paycheck stepping in and trying to make the system work, then I guess you best find a job elsewhere.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot to add about this other than to say, the reason that libertarianism is selected is because it's the sole quote unquote right wing ideology that sort of quote unquote again open-minded libs can tolerate. Like, in every lib circle, there is one libertarian who often, is culturally completely in line with the left, but, maybe wants a little lower taxes and anyway retreats from those arguments as soon as somebody says, well, it hurts minorities and women, right? So I think that's probably the reason for the selection, in all honesty. Yeah, I mean, it's fun to watch. I don't think maybe it does indicate a vibe shift, like Ben said, but I mean, it's not one that I trust. I don't think that the Washington Post is going to become even an honest broker in terms of reporting and journalism, let alone, a paper that defends free markets. So, I mean, I'm skeptical.
Yeah, it's worth noting. I mean, obviously, going libertarian, to your point, is like the socially acceptable thing for WaPo to do. It's not saying they're going MAGA, but I think any concession is illustrative of the fact that while they're not going to fully shift in accordance with the vibe shift, that they felt compelled to do anything, I think, is notable, and that it stirred up dissent within their own ranks is also entertaining to watch from the outside, at least. With that, we can, I guess, move to parting shots, and I'll open really briefly to avoid any awkward pause here. Worth noting, Kash Patel is FBI director. Dan Bongino is appointed deputy FBI director. It's just a remarkable shift in the tip of the spear of the rot, corruption, and weaponization that we've seen, particularly in the person of Kash Patel, who was right at the heart of exposing Russiagate, which was sort of the start of the weaponization, the anti-Trump weaponization that we've seen over the last decade, and really the weaponization against our entire constitutional order. So remarkable change in personnel there. Is also recently reported, and this is a little more inside baseball, but that Jeff Clark, who has also been targeted by the lawfare inquisitionists, is to head up OIRA, which is the regulatory review branch of the Office of Management and Budget. It's hugely essential for reviewing all rules and regulations, essentially, from the federal bureaucracy. So will be put in a vital seat there. And this is going to be critical to ensuring that the executive branch actually faithfully serves the executive. And to that point, lastly, since Humphrey's executor was brought up before, and the notion of independent agencies, which, as a non-lawyer on their face, seem pretty unconstitutional to me, that you can have these agencies that are basically operating as their own kind of branch. Humphrey's executor was a 1935 decision. I wrote about this for the Federalist recently, where the Supreme Court decided that the statute that started the FTC, which says that those who are leaders of the FTC on its board, its members, cannot be fired at will. They can only be fired for cause, that is constitutional. And so the notion of independent agencies really means insulated from control of the presidency, specifically over the personnel, which of course drive the policy. FDR was infuriated over this decision. He wanted to fire an FTC member who was appointed by Herbert Hoover, wasn't allowed to do it. The guy died, and his executor took over the case, seeking back pay, and that was the origin of all this. But the Supreme Court has not expanded this sort of idea that people leading independent agencies can be insulated. At the CFPB, for example, this came up before the Supreme Court, that there was only a one-person director leading that quote-unquote independent agency. So it's different from this other FTC circumstance where the court said it had quasi-legislative and quasi-judicial powers, and thus was sort of insulated from the presidency. I think we're going to have an opportunity to see independent agencies potentially be neutered of their independence by the Supreme Court. Justice Clarence Thomas might well play the role of Humphrey's executor's executioner when this comes up. He's written voluminously on how there's basically no place in our constitutional order for the notion of an independent agency. Subordinates have to be able to be removed by the president. It's essential to Article 2 powers. It's essential to separation of powers broadly, and really our constitutional order. So this administration has said, by the way, the Solicitor General has said that to the extent that its own personnel decisions within these quote unquote independent agencies are challenged by Humphrey's executor, that they're going to challenge it, including all the way up to the Supreme Court. So stand by. To the extent officers within these independent agencies can be fired at will, that essentially ends independent agencies in my reading and would be essential to the executive reasserting power over the executive branch, an essential fight that has to be had.
Yeah, following up on some of the things that Ben was talking about, just related to our first segment that we didn't have time for. So there's been a lot of focus on the impoundment power, and it's true that there's like a legitimate historical back and forth about this impoundment power. I almost see it as beside the point, and I'm kind of curious as to why the Trump administration is focusing so strongly on impoundment. Not because I necessarily disagree with their argument, but because it seems like there's a really much more first order and obvious way to deal with a lot of this spending, which is that it isn't appropriated to begin with. And you can look at USAID as a good example of that. Like almost none of these programs are appropriated. They're not line item appropriations. Like, yes, maybe a handful of programs that have been cut by DOGE are appropriated programs, and then you can use that impoundment argument. But a lot of it isn't appropriated to begin with, except on such an order of vagueness that essentially allows the executive branch to apply those funds wherever they want within like some, gauzy sounding language, like supporting the foreign policy of the president, right? Like that's the level of specificity that a lot of these things are appropriated by. So I don't think in a lot of these cases you even need to reach the question of impoundment. I think there's a blank check right now from Congress over the past 30 years to a lot of these agencies. And the question is, to Ben's point, who controls these agencies? Do they control themselves functionally, or are they controlled by the elected president? The first option is, anti-constitutional and anti-democratic. Also, I just wanted to make note, there's this story broken by Chris Rufo and as well as I think Hannah Grossman or something. Forgive me if I've forgotten your name, the second author on this, the reporter, but of these chats inside intelligence agencies. Apparently, Tulsi Gabbard has already fired about 100 intelligence officers from 15 agencies who were participating in, I'm not even going to repeat what's in the chats here. I mean, essentially like sex dungeons and, sex change stuff and, extremely graphic discussion. And the point is that this was happening on government servers sanctioned by government agencies, sanctioned time of our alleged intelligence apparatus, who has at least ostensibly a pretty important job they're supposed to be doing. They were spending hours and hours on these chats talking about the grossest, like perverted stuff under sanction from their bosses. So just once again, a really clear example of what the so-called adults in the room were doing with their time, and something that Congress should keep in mind when it's looking at what programs to keep running and what things to fund. And then finally, I can't help but note for the record that the IRS has now finally acknowledged that it discriminated against conservatives based on political opinion back in the Tea Party days, that Lois Lerner was in fact weaponizing the IRS against that administration's political opponents. It seems like something that should be noted on the record because, so many quote unquote very smart people have told us over the years that it didn't happen, that it was a bunch of conspiracy mongering from the right, and that it was just basically a garbage story, a piece of misinformation. But in keeping with transparency, this administration has finally acknowledged, and the IRS itself has acknowledged transparently that this did happen. What's going to come of it, whether that should affect, for example, Lois Lerner's ability to ride off into the sunset with a pension rather than face criminal charges, remains to be seen. But I think it's notable that the IRS has now formally admitted to politically targeting Americans for IRS audit.
My final thoughts are on the quote unquote gold card system that Trump is exploring implementing, where individuals can basically purchase a green card and eventually citizenship for $5 million a pop. He's also offering this up to corporations. If they want to purchase a gold card, then they can use that to transfer into a green card for an employee who would work for their company. I don't think this is a great idea. I would ask Trump to reconsider. I don't think we should be opening up the path to citizenship for purchase, to steal. And that's this phrase in a conversation we had offline. But I also see this very quickly being taken advantage of by wealthy people in China and the Gulf states who don't give a crap about American values or American society and want to use this as a way to gain access to people in power, particularly in the case of China, influence for the CCP. They've already been using people through illegal immigration to get American citizenship or to get access to America so that they can steal state secrets, spy, report back to the CCP, and have basically dual allegiance between the CCP and the United States. And we've already seen the consequences of allowing wealthy people to reap the benefits of Americanism without being Americans through the university system. We have oligarchs around the world sending their kids to the most elite colleges in the US, and then they don't end up actually contributing to our country. They either send the money back home or they just use it to create a network of people so that they can influence policy from abroad after they graduate. So I think this is a bit of a foolhardy idea. This should not be how we decide who gets to come to America legally and who eventually gets citizenship, whoever can bid the most amount of money. I understand Trump is trying to sell this as a way of driving down the deficit, of getting more money in the federal government's coffers, while continuing tax cuts for the American people. But I think citizenship and even just legal access to the United States is too precious of a commodity to just auction it off to the highest bidder. So I'm not on board with the gold card process, and hopefully JD Vance or someone else in the admin who maybe is a little bit more skeptical of Trump's posture towards legal immigration can help talk him out of this.
Yeah, my final thought is on the sort of humorous news that Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson have a new book coming out about Biden's decline. I know that I will say this. I think it's unbelievably shameless for Jake Tapper to be on this byline. Not so much Alex Thompson, who is, to his credit, one of the few mainstream media reporters who was willing to just go out and report on Biden's decline and what, some of the behind the scenes stuff in the White House. So I don't really want to give Jake Tapper money, but at the same time, I want to read this book. I've been waiting for the books to come out that actually explain what happened. And, ultimately, maybe you need somebody like Jake Tapper as the author to get the necessary interviews so that so that people willingly discuss this. So fine, whatever. I'm going to buy the book and go read it. So maybe you guys don't have to, and I'll report back.
Look forward to that book review. Definitely won't be buying it, but thank you for taking one for the team. And on that note, on behalf of Will, Amber, and Inez, thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Weingarten. We'll see you at the next NatCon Squad.